Please welcome to the stage, Jerry MARZINSKY and Dr. Andrew Kaufman.
All right. Good number. Nice done, huh?
We got Dr. Andrew Kaufman joining me today. He's a psychiatrist. We think he's the only psychiatrist of all. He's one of the few.
Louder.
I
wanted to make sure you knew.
Maybe three.
Ojo, turn it down.
I'm almost on time. Okay, that's better. Okay, I'm going to tell you the one time I was wondering what these voices were. And I'm going to tell you this one story, and Dr. Kaufman and I are going to talk to you together. There's one time where I was going, what are these things? You know, I was learning about them, I was studying about them, I didn't know what they were. I knew the patterns that they were running. So there was one time I prayed and said, hey Lord, let me experience these things once. Right? So nothing happened. 2 weeks later, what I do is after I got back from working my shift at the psych hospital, I go swimming. I lived on a lake. And I'd wait until almost sunset because rowboats were gone. And I didn't have to worry about being run over. So here I headed out into the lake. I was a strong swimmer. I loved the water. Scuba diver. I was comfortable in it. And I just started out. I hit my stride. And after some time, I kind of went, it's starting to get tired. So I came up and looked around like, where am I? And I was way out in the middle of the freaking lake. And looking around, and the sun's starting to set. And all of a sudden, this voice comes into my head, and it says, hey, the sun's going down. And, yeah, okay, the sun's going down. And you're too tired to make it back to the shore. Yeah, okay, I'm too tired to make it back to the shore. And if the sun goes down, you're going to be disoriented. You won't be able to see the shore. You know, well, yeah, that's true. What I recognized was I was being given a yes set, a psychological yes set. And I'm like, why would I run a yes set on myself? You know, but it got worse. So I agreed with, you know, all those things were true. And then what I had to do when you're tired like that, scuba diving, they teach you to put your arms behind your head and float like a dead man. And then when you run out of the air, you bring your head up, blow out the air, and suck in another breath real quick. And what you do is you start sinking as soon as you let out the air. And even though you took another breath of air, you keep sinking for a while, maybe 3-4 feet, until you bob back up again and float on the surface like a dead man. Okay, so second time I go to do that, I come up for air, and here's this thing again. Okay, you're too tired to make it back to the shore. The sun's going down, and you're going to drown. And I'm like, what? No, I'm not going to. That wasn't my thought. I wasn't the least bit worried about drowning. It wasn't even on my mind. And I'm like, what is this? You know? So I do it again, and then it does a yes set again. It's good. Okay, you're too far from it. Saying that these things, you know, 3/4 of what it's saying is true. And then I go, I'm going to drown. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to drown. So what I did is, when I went down, so you take the breath of air and blow it out, and then you sink, and you're like 3 feet underwater. Instead of popping back up to the surface, what I did is let out more air. And I started sinking faster. And I started sinking so fast that it startled me. But I knew what it was. It's a crush depth. You hit a certain depth, and it crushes your lungs, and you're no longer buoyant. You start sinking really fast. But considering how weird this was, as soon as I felt I was sinking real fast, I shot to the surface again. I went to the surface, took a breath of air, and here's this thing again. Okay, you're too far from the shore, the sun's going down, and you're panicking. You know, I wasn't panicking. So I went down again. went back through the thrush deck, and then all of a sudden, maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 feet underwater, I feel this cold something coming up my legs. And I shot to the surface again, because this was getting weird. And even before I got there, I knew what it was. It was the thermocline. So usually a layer of cold water that sinks down below the rest. Okay? And got to the surface, here it comes again. Okay, you're too far from the shore, the sun's going down, the lights are going out in the cabins, and you're going to drown. I'm like, what is this? Screw you, I'm not going to drown. So I went down again, went through the thermocline. It was like cold water, it was very cold, but this thermocline hadn't hit the bottom yet. So what I did is I went through the thermocline and I'm still sinking toward the bottom, equalizing the pressure in my ears. And then I hit something, I could feel it crawling on my leg. And it was like this ooky gooky stuff, and I shot to the surface again. And got up to the top, and this time it says, there's a motorboat coming your way, and it's going to hit you, and you can't see it because it's dark out, but the propeller's going to grind you in pieces. This wasn't me thinking these things, and I'm like, what is this thing? So I didn't hear a motorboat underwater because you can hear sound a long distance underwater. When I got up, here was a motorboat coming at me from the distance. And I looked, and this thing saying, they can't see you, they can't see you, they're going to hit you, they're going to grind you to pieces, and you're going to be dead. And I'm like, I've had to sink in the motorboats before scuba diving. I can do it if I need to, I'm not worried about it. So I'm watching this thing come on, and it passes maybe 30 feet in front of me. And I'm watching it pass, and I'm not paying attention to the wake, And the wake washes over me just as I'm taking in a breath of air. So I got a mouthful of water, and I'm spitting it out, coughing it up. And here's this thing again. Okay, it's dark, you almost got hit by a motorboat, you're too tired to make it back to the shore, the lights are going out, you're going to drown. I went, screw you, what is this thing? So I sunk down to the bottom, hit the bottom, I don't know, it must have been 30, 35 feet, and my feet stuck in the mud, and I'm just kind of floating like a dead man in the bottom of the lake. And the water was like bath water, and there was no light because it was dark. Okay, at the bottom of the lake at night, it's dark. My feet are stuck in the mud. There is no sound. There is no feeling. And I'm scared. So my mind shut off, and I'm waiting for something to grab me down at the bottom of the lake. And it was complete silence. I had all senses were shut off, and I went, wow, that's what's there beyond all this input. I was aware that I was aware, and that's what's there. Past all the noise, past all the vision, past all the distraction, you are pure awareness. That's who you really are. You're a spirit. Psychiatry doesn't believe in spirit. So I got Dr. Andrew Kaufman here. We're two birds of a feather. He's a psychiatrist, and we're going to be talking to you together.
Well, let me just give you a little bit of my psychiatric background, because I don't think I talked about it yesterday, but I actually specialized in forensic psychiatry, which is very much related to Jerry's work experience working inside correctional facilities and forensic mental hospitals. And I also have the experience in those types of facilities. I worked in jails, prisons, and in the forensic mental hospital system, which is not a pleasant place. And I can say from my personal experience that almost everything that Jerry talked about in his presentation is backed up. Like, for example, the fact that they don't teach you in psychiatry anything about the voices themselves. They just refer to them as auditory hallucinations. There's only in the very small specialty of forensic psychiatry that they talk about this at all, but they don't talk about it from the point of view of understand what's going on in a psychotic individual, or from the point of view of how can you better help someone with this experience. It's only from the point of view of how to detect if someone's faking it versus the real thing. because there are serious legal implications like the insanity defense, for example. And certainly...
Oh, Joe.
What?
There you go. You're good.
I know a lot about the toxicity of psychiatric drugs. And from sleeping pills to antidepressants to antipsychotics, they all increase your mortality in the short term, in 5 years or less. And interestingly, when we experienced all those sudden deaths of athletes who were vaccinated during COVID, I was already aware of sudden death toxicity because it occurs from antipsychotic drugs. There was a large study in Tennessee looking at adolescents and children who are prescribed antipsychotics, which is something that came about in recent decades through basically a partnership with pharmaceutical industries and some famous professors at major universities who decided to say that children get bipolar disorder, and any violent or difficult children actually have this, and that justified giving them antipsychotics. So they looked at all the Medicaid recipients who received antipsychotics in Tennessee and found that there were a substantial number of cases of sudden death. And I even saw one of these cases with a very toxic drug called clozapine that a girl at the state hospital where I wasn't working at the time, but the patient was under my care at a different facility a couple of months before the sudden death. So I ended up hearing about it. So the psychiatric system is very much a system of control, and they use these poisons as part of their mechanism of control, as well as the criminal system, as Jerry pointed out, since deinstitutionalization. And do you want me to tell the case about using your techniques?
I want to let you know that the psychiatric mafia is making $11 billion a year selling these antipsychotic drugs worldwide. Not million, billion. They're making $4.7 billion selling antidepressant drugs. They want no interference with that. Okay? Their psychiatric Bible, the DSM, it was put together by a group of psychiatrists, 2/3 of which are in league with Big Pharma. So I've heard it was like a tobacco barn where somebody kind of comes in and they go, oh, I got a new psychiatric diagnosis and it consists of this and that and da-da-da-da. And they go, well, can we make a medicine now to treat that? And that's how they do these things. So the DSM is going from, I think, like 150 people back in the 50s or 60s to 200 something, and 10 years later, now it's almost 300. You know, they make up these diagnoses and they put them in this big psychiatric Bible, and there's not a single psychiatric test or biological test or lab test or any kind of test that will differentiate these diagnoses from one another. And they're basically subjective groups of behavior, and it's left up to the psychiatrist to determine, you know, what's what.
Yeah, well, let me expand on that a little, because Jerry's absolutely right that all the psychiatric diagnoses, and there have been, 5 major revisions of that Bible he's referring to, and each time the number of diagnoses gets severely bloated. I think there are, in several hundred now, and as he said, how many?
296.
296 in the DSM-5, and not one of them is a valid real diagnosis that has incontrovertible evidence to back it up. They're really just a bunch of experts in a room with, conflicts of interest type influences who arbitrarily say, oh yeah, let's create this category, and then let's create this subcategory, and et cetera, which is why it's all based on, symptom checklists. And you can see the same exact symptoms in multiple different categories of diagnosis. And in the world of psychiatric hospitals and the criminally insane, it is psychiatrists making these diagnoses, and many times what happens is that when they go to a different psychiatrist, the diagnoses change. And you'll see like a whole bunch of different ones in their history, which of course gives you a clue that none of them are valid. But actually, by and large, the greatest number of these psychiatric drugs are prescribed by primary care doctors, internists and family medicine doctors. And those doctors have no required training in mental health treatment at all during their residency. Some of them may have some, but it's not required, so most don't have any. And I've reviewed many records of these doctors diagnosing depression or anxiety or other things and prescribing medications, and this is the extent of what's in their records. Patient reports depressed, denies suicidal thoughts, diagnosis depression, plan, prescribe, Prozac or Celexa or whatever. So there's no exploration at all into what's going on, nothing about, oh, did somebody die recently? Is your marriage going okay? How are things at work? What about your children? How are the finances, right? All the obvious things that can be involved in a crisis in life, they're not even thought of or considered whatsoever. Just give the prescription and feed the big machine.
Yeah, and this DSM, Directory of, what is it, Statistical?
Yeah, it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
It looks impressive. You open it up and it's got these classifications and sub-classifications and then sub-sub-classifications. It looks like a real scientific work, but it's garbage. It's basically classes of behavior. Some of the diagnoses they have in there, it's mathematics disorder. If you don't like mathematics, you're disorder. They added caffeine disorder, so you drink too much coffee, you're disorder. Sibling relational disorder, so your kids are fighting, they're disorder. They have Florence syndrome, it's being overwhelmed by beauty, such as in Florence, Italy. The symptoms of fainting, dizziness, and antidepressant drugs. Paris syndrome, mostly experienced by Japanese patients visiting France, includes depression, anxiety, feelings of persecution, and we'd call that culture shock in my day.
Well, Tom Cowan has talked about ADHD a number of times, and he gives a very interesting anecdote about when he was, learning about this, and he asked the psychiatrist, because one of the criteria for ADHD is excessive tapping, like tapping the finger. So Tom asked him, he's like, well, how many, taps is excessive? Like, what if they tap 10 times a minute? Is that excessive, or does it have to be 15? Like, where's the cutoff, right? And you can see how ridiculous it sounds once you get into that kind of, ludicrous arguments and rationales. But there's another important aspect of the DSM that involves its commercial interest, because each one of these, almost 300 diagnoses has a special numerical code, and that's part of the ICD-10, the International Classification of Disease. And that's a little bit misleading, because really what that is a billing code. Because if you're a psychiatrist, in order to bill insurance or Medicaid or Medicare, there needs to be a qualifying diagnostic code. And so those codes are what you put on the billing form. So really what it is it should be the billing and statistical manual.
That's right. So I have some stats here. It's like in 1952, the DSM had 106 psychiatric disorders. In 1980, it had 256. Now, the DSM-5 lists 297. So they sit there and they make these things up out of thin air. And then they're like, okay, can we just do a drug or treat them? The other fallacy is their, what is it called, the chemical imbalance theory. They're insisting that the brain is out of balance, it's chemically imbalanced. And one of the things I saw when I was working at the state hospital, I'd go into the psychiatrist's office with my patient, and the psychiatrist would talk to him, make a diagnosis, and then prescribe some kind of drug. And I'm watching this and we're going, well, if it's a chemical imbalance in their brain, like they're insisting it is, and they have in all the literature on what they're teaching at the universities, what is the baseline? What chemical is out of balance in their brain and by how much? They don't know. They don't even know what the chemical balance in the brain should be. It was made up by Eli Lilly back in the 70s when they came out with Prozac. They had to have some explanation for why their drug worked. So they just made one up, the chemical imbalance. So it got spread to all mental illnesses, some kind of chemical imbalance that can be treated by some kind of psychiatric drug. It's bullcrap. They're lying to you. They're lying to the whole planet. You know? There is no chemical imbalance. They proved that over and over again. So they started out with blaming mothers, back in the 50s. All the mothers did something they called schizophrenia. The mothers, what did we do? And they couldn't find anything. So they went, well, it must be something genetic. So they went with that for another 10 years. And the geneticists, when they got around to studying it, they went, hey, we don't see a gene for schizophrenia. It just doesn't exist. And then the psychiatric mafia went, well, it's not just one gene, it's a whole bunch of genes, and they're all tangled together, and we'll figure it out eventually, but we know it's a gene. And then what? They don't know anything. So then they kicked it up to the chemical imbalance. So they've got lie after lie after lie. It's what causes mental illness. They're not looking at the spiritual cause. We're all spiritual beings. These entities that I've been talking about are spiritual, energetic entities, and they hit us all. Every negative, intrusive thought that you have run through your head is coming from them, not you. And the schizophrenics hear these voices either inside their head or outside. So what I found is when they get strong enough, they start hearing them outside of their head. And then they know for sure, hey, this isn't me. And that's pretty spooky when that happens. But the voices don't do that until they feel they have solid control of the person.
Jerry, I just want to back up and emphasize what you're saying about what's going on with how they're explaining things in the official medical literature. And he's correct in pointing out the evolution of trying to search for it. But all of their thinking, there's two things going on. One is they're only thinking in the context of materialist reductionism. So it can only be caused by physical matter because that's all there is. They look at consciousness and personality and things like that as an emergent property of the physical brain. So they're only looking at the physical brain. So that's one part and that would of course prevent them from looking into the immaterial realm, which is where Jerry's work is focused. And the second aspect is that once there is a popular hypothesis that's put forth in medical science, they just never give up on it, no matter how many experiments they do and they don't get the results that they want, because with respect to the chemical imbalance, right, this came because they had a drug that they thought worked, and they noticed in laboratory assays that the drug had some effect on some neurotransmitters. So they said, oh, well, there must be an imbalance of the neurotransmitters that the drug is correcting. But they had no direct evidence of what a balance was and what an imbalance was in any way. And they tried feverishly. I mean, they were just tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of research funds put forth to try and find just the serotonin connection to depression. And when I was in my psychiatric residency at Duke, one day, because there were a lot of researchers there working on this issue, they made this big announcement. And I think they might have even made it to the whole hospital, but definitely the whole psychiatry department, which was pretty big. And they said that they had found the genetic mutation that related to serotonin that was the cause of depression. And there was like an impromptu reception scheduled like at 5 o'clock that day where they had booze and everything, and everyone was super happy. And then it just sort of like suddenly faded off and disappeared. And then what I found out was that they had this huge database of nursing homes and all these genetic samples, and they were doing data mining, and they just identified an anomaly. And when other scientists tried to use the same data set to get the same result, they didn't find it. And the whole thing was basically just totally bogus. And everyone just continued, like no one said, you know, maybe we should rethink this whole hypothesis. They just kept on going and continued their research and said, oh, well, we'll just keep looking, we'll find it eventually, or we'll figure out another explanation for our results, like it's not one genetic mutation, it's a family of genetic mutations, right? Which keeps the idea alive, despite them having no evidence to back up their hypothesis.
Psychology isn't any better. They did a study of several different studies of the research that psychologists were doing. And they found out that only 75 to 80% of them could not be replicated. So I remember when I was in the PhD program, it was like publish or perish. They had to publish something. You know, it was like I was doing some research and I wanted to do something original. My advisor said, "Man, don't do that. Just do the same thing they're doing and put it in there and just add it to the list." You know. Then there was the thing I told. Did I tell the story about the head of the department lying on statistics? You know, so that he was teaching us how to lie with statistics. This was the head of the department. He used to be a preacher. So you can't trust virtually anything that they write either. So, and you take an overlook at the entire system. The CDC reports that 132 people in the U.S. kill themselves every day. You know, 24 of those are veterans. Suicide is the 11th leading cause of death in the U.S. Almost 50,000 people a year after year after year, are killing themselves in the United States. Now this is despite the fact that we have more psychologists, more psychiatrists, more psychiatric drugs than ever in the history of mankind on this planet right now, and nobody's getting any better. The population is getting sicker. The prisons are full to overflowing with mentally ill. The psych hospitals are full to overflowing. The state hospitals are full. Nobody is getting any better. You know,
Let me talk about that suicide issue, and also, if anyone wants to ask a question while I'm telling this, why don't you come up to the stage, and we'd be happy to take a couple of questions. So this also happened when I was in my residency, that the FDA issued a black box warning on antidepressants for children, and it was kind of a weird phrasing. They said that it can increase suicidal behaviors. I'm not sure what suicidal behaviors is, right? Because it's usually we talk about suicide attempts, but nonetheless, this was the black box warning. And you know, that means that if you're going to prescribe these drugs to children or possibly even adults, that you're going to be under additional scrutiny and liability. So all the faculty in the department, you know, took us, all the residents, the trainees, because we were prescribing these things frequently, and they got us together in a special meeting to talk about this, and here's what they told us. They said, obviously this isn't really true, it's depression, but since they did this, we have to, you know, cover our ass, so to speak, and so if anyone now that you start on an antidepressant, in the next 3 days, sometimes you're going to have to call them and make sure that they're not suicidal, so that basically you protect us from being sued. But we're not taking it seriously. And I, at the time, kind of thought it wasn't true also, because I couldn't conceive of how a drug could cause someone to behave or think a certain way. But then, several years later, after I was much more awake to the problems of psychiatry and had the practice of tapering all my patients off psychiatric drugs, because they all came to me already on them, I noticed that a group of teenage girls were having frequent suicidal thoughts, and so I asked them about the relationship between the drugs they were taking. And several of them told me that it was after they started taking the antidepressant that they were thinking about suicide on a daily basis. And then when I took them off the drugs, they stopped thinking about suicide on a daily basis. So in some way, I can't explain it, but these antidepressant drugs were actually causing suicidal thoughts, and when you have suicidal thoughts, that is going to increase the chance of actual suicide attempts. So what Jerry's talking about is kind of built into the system, even though almost all the practitioners are either ignorant of it or in denial of it, like, you know, they were at Duke, for example. But they all know that they have no interventions that can prevent suicide. The only thing they can do is lock someone up and watch them to intervene if they try to kill themselves. That's really the only thing that they have to do, and they do that. They do that in jails too, and it's extremely unpleasant for the person going through the crisis. But that's why, right, the stresses of society increase, the prescriptions of these drugs increase, the control system increases, and so does suicide as a consequence.
Say a word about what they're doing with children with these nasty toxic drugs. Now this is from 2017, so it's much worse right now. In 2017, more than 7.2 million kids are on psychiatric drugs. The psychiatric children, let me see, over 622,000 of them are under the age of 5. So they're given these toxic psychiatric drugs that destroy brain cells and, you know, worsen their physical condition to kids under 5. Over 80,000 were on ADHD drugs, which are methamphetamine. Now, when I went into prison, a whole group of these people went crazy on methamphetamine. And what happened is they started using the drugs, and then they'd start hearing voices, and they went, oh, that's just a hallucination, it'll go away when it comes down. And it did. And it might have done that 5 times, 20 times, 50 times. And then one day, they didn't. They were there permanently, and they were just as psychotic as any of the psychotic patients that were, you know, had it by other means. So over 38,000 kids were put on antidepressants, you know, and like Doctor was saying, these drugs had warnings, suicidal ideation of putting kids on them. Over 389,000 were put on anti-anxiety drugs. Most of those are addictive.
Plus, you know, the stimulants cause growth retardation. I mean, I've had many teenagers that were taking stimulants, like, you know, they are very closely related to methamphetamine chemically, and there were kids who were particularly short, and every single time I tapered a kid off those stimulant medications, they had major growth spurts. So what would happen if they continue taking those drugs all the way through maturity? I think you know the answer.
You guys got any questions? We're about out of time. Any questions?
Yeah, hey, thanks guys. This is a fascinating conversation. For those of us with family and friends who are on SSRIs, I have a family member who's on one SSRI for anxiety, had like a, what do you call it, nervous breakdown, and that's what they're on. Is there any scenario where you guys would recommend, okay, this person needs to be on an SSRI, or do you have protocols and ideas that, no one ever needs that ever?
Well, there's a new energetic psychotherapy, cutting-edge psychotherapy out right now. It's called the Mason Energy Method. It works wonders for depression and trauma. It doesn't do as well with schizophrenia. I'd say maybe we got maybe a 30 to 35% cure rate right now. But for depression and anxiety and trauma and the normal psychological problems, It's an energetic psychotherapy. It's not like anything that you've ever had before. It's not a talk therapy. It works with energy. It goes in there and it dissolves that negative emotional energy. And it's like you might have gone through a horrible trauma, and there's this bad feeling that's left. That bad feeling is gone afterwards. You still remember the trauma, but it doesn't affect you. It's like, oh yeah, I remember it. It's no big deal.
Well, Jerry, thanks for answering the question by giving an alternative, but to address the question more directly, is there ever a good time to take poison? But the people who take it may perceive a benefit, actually let me rephrase that, may misperceive that the drug was actually beneficial. And this can happen in a number of ways. It can be through a placebo effect, of course. I watched something called the Maudsley Debates, which is at one of the universities in England, at like an annual event. It's a big academic debate. And they had a skeptic of psychiatric medications who formerly was the main guy of the Cochrane database. And then they had a patient who suffered from recurrent depression. And the patient was, arguing that the medications were benefiting him. And he told this story about being terribly depressed, and he was put on one antidepressant. He didn't get better. After a couple of months, they switched him to another antidepressant. He still didn't get better. After a couple more months, they switched him to another antidepressant, and then he started getting better. So he attributed it to the antidepressant, but essentially he got better, and he's been taking a bunch of antidepressants, but there was no evidence that there was any causality there, right? He already failed all these meds. Why would he think that it was the medicine that made the difference, right? It's just because he was of the mindset that medicine is good, doctors are good, they know what they're doing, right? It shows that it worked. So people can believe it worked, even though they got better for another reason, right? And if they strongly believe it worked, they can actually get better from that belief itself, and that can work both ways. If they believe that it's harmful, it can actually be more harmful, right? And that may be happening with some of the people with schizophrenia whose voices are telling them that psychiatrists are poisoning them, that when they take the drugs, they get even more of the toxic effects because of that nocebo effect, right? The kind of the dark side of the placebo effect. And then lastly, I want to leave you, there's a large study, I believe it's been replicated one additional time, because one study is from a Women's Health Initiative data, and then another study up in Toronto with large numbers, like maybe 100,000 or more people who are taking antidepressants versus not taking antidepressants, and these were multivariate analysis. And in the Women's Health study, they showed a significantly increased strokes in the women who were taking antidepressants, that many of which were fatal. And in the Toronto study, it was something like 40% increased mortality at 5 years. And all attributed just to antidepressants. So the longer you take it, the more the risk is, and it's not worth it. If the person's recovered, even if they believe that it helped them, they can say, okay, well, they don't need it now, they're in remission, so it's time to taper it off of it. Tapering off of it can be challenging. Can be physiologic withdrawal, but I've done it successfully with hundreds of people. So there's Dr. Kelly Brogan. There are services and books and such out there, like, for example, A Mind of Your Own by Kelly Brogan talks about tapering off of it. She has the Vital Mind Reset, which is like a group service for that. I have consulted with many people about that, so there's information and it can be done safely and effectively.
Any other questions you might have?
Lately, we've been seeing more research coming out validating parasites as an etiology for various diseases, including cancer, multiple sclerosis, even urinary tract infections, and Alzheimer's. And I'm wondering if there might be any cross-links between these physical parasites and the apparent psychic parasites that you're uncovering? Or even research, if you know any.
Well, I've heard some stories to that effect, but I haven't read any research on it. But, yeah.
That's not true. These studies are not finding that at all. In fact, if you look carefully at the relationship between parasites and disease, they don't cause any diseases, just like other germs don't. Daniel Roydas has some really in-depth work on that you can find out there. He's the author of the book, Can You Catch a Cold?, which goes over all the contagion studies that show that there's no such thing as contagion. So a lot of this comes from the false narrative about ivermectin, that it's a cure-all, and if you actually look at the studies and read the methods and read the results, you'll see that there's not conclusive proof of anything of the like. But there could be still a relationship between cancer and other, severe illnesses and parasites, because when the body is damaged, that's when microorganisms come to try to alleviate the problem and eat up the debris and the dead cells, right? And that's why we see bacteria and fungi and some parasites like worms even. And it's very, very common when I've worked with clients and they do certain cleansing protocols that worms come out. But the worms weren't the cause of the problem. They come out because they're not needed anymore if the underlying factors that are damaging the tissue is different. But what Jerry's talking about here is really different from these, physical aspects, right? Because the entity that are causing the problem are not physical entities. And I don't think we know exactly how they interface with your internal thinking. Could it be through parasites? I mean, there's some kind of possibility, but you haven't found any evidence of that,
No,
have you?
and I don't know how they remove the energy either. I had several patients tell me I can feel them taking my energy, but I have no idea how they do it. None. It's a mystery to me, but it's consistent. Virtually every schizophrenic you talk to was said after the voices attack, my energy level's down to nothing. I don't know how they do it. Any other questions?
All right, one more back there. This will be, I think, the last one because of our time limit.
Thanks to both of you gentlemen for coming and bringing the information forth. I have a question related to treatment as far as medical conditions or even schizophrenia like you were talking about. Maybe you have any experience about frequency and vibration treatment, sound treatment?
Yeah, the question was, can you apply sound or other kinds of frequency treatments to this problem? And I think Jerry doesn't know much about it, but I'll tell you about one thing I know. There's a lot of gimmicks out there with different machines and devices and such, so definitely do your due diligence. But there is one interesting theory called biofield tuning. And Eileen McCusick is one of the main people there. And she's done a lot of really good empirical science to validate it, and it uses tuning forks, and the idea is that your electromagnetic field around the body, right, which is well documented that it exists. This is, what they do when they measure your EKG, for example. They're measuring the electromagnetic field of your heart. That you can use tuning forks to assess blockages in the field that indicate certain psychological issues, and there's actually a map that she has mapped out. And this can definitely be useful to help identify things that are blocked from your memory as the cause. Like when Jerry mentioned the MACE method, an energetic method, like one of the brilliant things about that is it can help people who have been traumatized who can't remember their trauma or who can't tolerate talking about it, whereas psychotherapy, you have to bring up your trauma and talk about it and confront it. So biofield tuning can help you identify things that you may not remember that influenced your life. And They also claim that they can do some therapeutic improvements by overcoming these blockages. So I think that's definitely something that's worthwhile looking into. It's helped many, many people, and as an alternative, that definitely is something that will not be harmful or poisonous in any way.
And the last thing I want to leave you with is when I went to the bottom of the lake with that voice didn't sound any different than the thousands of thoughts that went through my head on a regular day. There's no like, the voices. It sounds just like your regular thought stream for the most part. So you hear a thought, it sounds just like all the other thousands of thoughts that go through your head on a regular day. But the intention is very different and the content is very different. It's always negative. So when you have these negative thoughts, oh, I shouldn't have said that, or he thinks this, or they're laughing at me. That's them. They put those thoughts into your thought stream, and they want you to believe that that thought belongs to you, because it sounds like, oh, who else could it belong to? It doesn't belong to you. Virtually every negative thought you have is coming from outside of you. I'll leave it there.
Get tickets to this year's event at internationaltruthexpo.com.